Sheriff Doane looked at his deputy and then down at the daisies he had picked for his weekly visit, lying wrapped in newspaper on his desk. I'm sorry to hear you say that, Toby. I was kind of counting on you to take over after me. Don't get me wrong, Doane, Toby said, looking through the front window. I'm not afraid. I'll see you through this shindig. I'm not afraid of Jordan or young Jordan or any of them. But I want to tell you now, I'll wait till Jordan's train gets in. I'll wait to see what he does. I'll see you through whatever happens. But after that, I'm quitting. Doane began kneading his knuckles, his face set against the pane as he gently rubbed the arthritic, twisted bones. He said nothing. Toby looked around, his brown eyes troubled in his round, olive-skinned face. I mean, what's the use of holding down a job like this? Look at you. What did you ever get out of it? Enough to keep you eating. And what for? Doane stopped kneading his arthritic hands and looked down at the star on his shirt front. He looked from it to the smaller one on Toby's. That's right. They don't even hang the right ones. You risk your life catching somebody, and the damn juries let them go so they can come back and shoot at you. You're poor all your life, you got to do everything twice, and in the end, they pay you off in lead, so you can wear a tin star. It's a job for a dog, son. Toby's voice did not rise, but his eyes were a little wider in his round, gentle face. Then why keep on with it? What for? I've been working for you for 2 years, trying to keep the law so sharp-nosed money grabbers can get rich while we piddle along on what the county pays us. I've seen men I used to bust playing marbles going up and down the street on $400 saddles. And what have I got? Nothing. Not a damn thing. There was a little smile around Doane's wide mouth. That's right, Toby. It's all for free. The headaches, the bullets, and everything. All for free. I found that out long ago. But somebody's got to be around to take care of things. He looked out of the window at the people walking up and down the crazy boardwalks. I like it free. You know what I mean? You don't get a thing for it. You've got to risk everything. But you're free inside. Like the larks. You know the larks? How they get up in the sky and sing when they want to? A pretty bird. A very pretty bird. That's the way I like to feel inside. Toby looked at him without expression. That's the way you look at it. I don't see it. I've only got one life. You talk about doing it all for nothing, and that gives you something. What? What have you got now, waiting for Jordan to come? I don't know yet. We'll have to wait and see. Toby turned back to the window. All right, but I'm through. I don't see any sense in risking your neck for nothing. Maybe you will, Doane said, beginning to work on his hands again. Oh, here comes Metric. I guess he doesn't give up so easy. And he's still got that resignation in his hand. I guess he doesn't, Doane said. But I'm through listening. Has young Jordan come out of the saloon yet? No, Toby said and stepped aside as the door opened. Metric came in. Now listen, Doane, he burst out. For the last time. Shut up, Percy, Doane said. Sit down over there and shut up or get out. The flare went out of the mayor's eyes. Doane, he moaned. You are the biggest. Shut up, Doane said. Toby, has he come out yet? Toby stood a little back from the window where the slant of golden sunlight swarming with dust wouldn't strike his white shirt. Yeah, he's got a chair. And he's looking this way, Doane. He's still drinking. I can see a bottle on the porch beside him. I expected that. Not that it makes much difference. He looked down at the bunch of flowers. Metric, in the straight chair against the wall, looked up at him, his black eyes scornful in his long, hopeless face. Don't make much difference. Who the hell do you think you are, Doane? God? It just means he'll start the trouble without waiting for his stinking brother, that's all it means. His hand was shaking, and the white paper hanging listlessly from his fingers fluttered slightly. He looked at it angrily and stuck it out at Doane. I give it to you. I did the best I could. Whatever happens, don't be blaming me, Doane. I gave you a chance to resign, and if... He left off and sat looking at the paper in his hand as though it were a dead puppy of his that somebody had run a buggy over. Doane, standing with the square, almost chisel-pointed tips of his fingers touching the flowers, turned slowly with the care of movement he would have used around a crazy horse. I know you're my friend, Percy. Just take it easy. If I don't resign, it's not because I'm ungrateful. Hey, here comes Staley with the news, Toby said from the window. He looks like somebody just shot his grandmother. Percy Metric laid his paper on the desk and began smoothing it out ruefully. It's not as though it were dishonorable, Doane. You should have quit 2 years ago when your hands went bad. It's not dishonorable now. You still got time. He glanced up at the wall clock. It's only 3. You got an hour before he gets here. You can take your horse. As Metric talked to himself, Doane looked slantwise at him with his little smile, and he grew more cheerful. Here. He jabbed a pen out to Doane. Sign it and get out of town. The smile left Doane's mouth. This is an elective office. I don't have to take orders even if you are the mayor. His face softened. It's simpler than you think, Percy. When they didn't hang Jordan, I knew this day would come. 5 years ago, I knew it was coming when they gave him that silly sentence. I've been waiting for it. But not to commit suicide, Metric said in a low voice, his eyes going down to Doane's gouty hands. Doane's knobby, twisted fingers closed slowly into fists as though hiding themselves, and his face flushed slightly. I may be slow, but I can still shoot. The mayor stood up and went slowly over to the door. Goodbye, Doane. I'm not saying goodbye, Percy. Not yet. Goodbye, Metric repeated and went out the door. Toby turned from the window. His face was tight around the mouth. You should have resigned like you said, Doane. You ain't a match for one of them alone, much less 2 of them together. And if Pierce and Frank Colby come too, like they was all together before... Shut up, Doane said. For God's sake, shut up. He sat down suddenly at the desk and covered his face with his hands. Maybe jail changes a man. He was sitting stiff, hardly breathing. What are you going to do, Doane? Nothing. I can't do anything until they start something. I can't do a thing. Maybe jail does change a man. Sometimes it does. I remember... Listen, Doane, Toby said, his voice for the first time urgent. It may change some men, but not Jordan. It's already planned, whatever they're going to do. Why else would young Jordan be over there watching? He's come 300 miles for this. I've seen men go into jail hard as a rock and come out peaceful and settle down. Maybe Jordan... Toby's face relapsed into dullness. He turned back to the window listlessly. Doane's hands dropped. You don't think that's true, Toby? Toby sighed. You know what isn't so, Doane. He swore he'd get you. That's the truth. Doane's hands came up again in front of his face. But this time he was looking at them, his big gray eyes going quickly from one to the other, almost as though he were afraid of them. He curled his fingers slowly into fists, and uncurled them slowly, pulling with all his might, yet slowly. A thin sheen on his face reflected the sunlight from the floor. He got up. Is he still there? He asked. Oh, sure, he's still there. Maybe he'll get drunk. Dead drunk. Huh, you can't get a Jordan that drunk. Doane stood looking at the floor, staring back and forth along one of the cracks. Why didn't they hang him? He asked the silence in the room. Why didn't they hang him? He repeated, his voice louder. Toby kept his post by the window, not moving a muscle in his face, staring out at the man across the street. I don't know, he said. For murder they should. I guess they should have, but they didn't. Doane's eyes came to the flowers, and some of the strain went out of his face. Then suddenly his eyes closed and he gave a long sigh, and then luxuriously stretched his arms. Good God, he said, a voice easy again. It's funny how it comes over you like that. He shook his head violently. I don't know why it should, but it's not the first time. But it always does. I know, Toby said. It just builds up and then it busts. I know. The train may be late. Toby said nothing. You can never tell, Doane said, buckling on his gun belt. Things may have changed with Jordan. Maybe he won't even come. You never can tell. I'm going up to the cemetery as soon as we hear from Staley. I wouldn't. You just tempt young Jordan to start something. I've been going up there every Sunday since she died. We'd best both just stay in here and let them make the first move. Feet sounded on the steps outside, and Doane stopped breathing for a second. Staley came in, his face pinched, tight and dead, his eyes on the floor. Doane looked at him carefully. Is it on time? He asked steadily. Staley looked up, his faded blue eyes distant, pointed somewhere over Doane's head. Mr. Doane, you ain't handled this thing right. You should have drove young Jordan out of town. His hand went to his chest and he took off his deputy's badge. What are you doing? Doane asked sharply. If you'd have handled it right, we could have beat this, Staley said, his voice a little louder. You know nobody's done nothing yet, Toby said softly, his gentle brown eyes on Staley. There's nothing we can do until they start something. I'm quitting, Mr. Doane, Staley said. He looked around for someplace to put the star. He started for the desk, hesitated, then awkwardly, with a peculiar difficulty, laid the star on the windowsill. Doane's jaw began to jut a little. You still haven't answered my question. Is the train on time? Yes. 4:10, just on time. Staley stood, staring at Doane, then swallowed. I saw Frank Colby. He was in the livery putting up his horse. He'd had a long ride on that horse. I asked him what he was doing in town, friendly-like. He ducked his head and swallowed again. He didn't know I was a deputy. I had my star off. He looked up again. They're all meeting together, Mr. Doane. Young Jordan, Colby, and Pierce. They're going to meet Jordan when he comes in. The same four. So you're quitting, Doane said. Yes, sir. It ain't been handled right. Toby stood looking at him, his gentle eyes dull. Get out, he said, his voice low and tight. Staley looked at him, nodded, tried to smile, which was too weak to last. Sure. Toby took a step toward him. Staley's eyes were wild as he stood against the door. He tried to back out of Toby's way. Get out, Toby said again, and his small brown fist flashed out. Staley fell backward and fell down the steps in a sprawling heap, scrambled to his feet and hobbled away. Toby closed the door slowly. He stood rubbing his knuckles, his face red and tight. That didn't do any good, Doane said softly. Toby turned on him. It couldn't do no harm, he said acidly, throwing the words into Doane's face. You want to quit too? Doane asked, smiling. Sure I want to quit, Toby shot out. Sure. Go on to your blasted cemetery. Go on with your flowers, old man. He sat down suddenly on the straight chair. Put a flower up there for me, too. Doane went to the door. Put some water on the heater, Toby, and set out that liniment that the vet gave me. I'll try it again when I get back. It might do some good yet. He let himself out and stood in the sunlight on the porch, the flowers drooping in his hand, looking against the sun, across the street, at the dim figure under the shaded porch. Then he saw two other shapes hunkered against the front of the saloon, in the shade of the porch, one on each side of young Jordan, who sat tilted back in a chair. Colby and Pierce. Doane pulled the brim of his hat farther down in front, and stepped slowly down to the board sidewalk, observing carefully from squinted eyes, and just as carefully avoiding any pause which might be interpreted as a challenge. Young Jordan had the bottle to his lips as Doane came out. He held it there for a moment, motionless, and then, as Doane reached the walk, he passed the bottle slowly sideward to Colby and leaned forward away from the wall so that the chair came down softly. He sat there, leaning forward slightly, watching while Doane untied his horse. As Doane mounted, Jordan got up. Colby's hand grabbed one of his arms, and he shook it off and untied his own horse from the rail. Doane's mouth tightened and his eyes looked a little sad. He turned his horse, holding the flowers so the jog would not rattle off the pedals, and headed up the street looking straight ahead. The hoofs of his horse made soft, almost inaudible little plops in the deep dust. Behind him, he heard a sudden stamping of hooves and the harsh crashing of wood. He looked back. Young Jordan's horse was up on the sidewalk, wild-eyed and snorting, with young Jordan leaning forward, half out of the saddle, pushing himself back from the horse's neck, back off the horn into the saddle, swaying insecurely. And, as Jordan managed the horse off of the sidewalk, Doane looked quickly forward again, his eyes fixed distantly ahead and blank. He passed men that he knew, and out of the corner of his eye he saw their glances slowly follow him, calm or gloomy or shrewdly speculative. As he passed, he knew their glances were shifting to the man whose horse was softly coming up behind him. It was like that all the way up the street. The flowers were now starting to droop. The town ended with a few Mexican shacks, the road dwindling to broad ruts, and the sage was suddenly on all sides of him, stretching away to where the heat obscured mountains like an infinite multitude of gray-green sheep. He turned off the road and began the slight ascent up to the little hill where the cemetery lay. Grasshoppers shrilled invisibly in the sparse, dried grass along the track, silent as he came by, and shrilled again as he passed, only to become silent again as the other rider came. He swung off at the rusty wire Missouri gate and slipped the loop from the post, and the shadow of the other slid tall across his path and stopped. Doane licked his lips quickly and looked up, his grasp tightening on the now sweat-wilted newspaper. Young Jordan was sitting on his horse, open-mouthed, leaning forward with his hands to the pommel to support himself, his eyes vague and dull. His lips were wet and red and hung in a slight smile. A lark made a sound to his left, and then Doane saw it. rising into the air. It hung in the sun over the cemetery. Moving steadily and avoiding all suddenness, Doane hung his reins over the post. "You don't like me, do you?" young Jordan said. A long thread of saliva descended from the corner of his slackly smiling mouth. Doane's face set into a sort of blank preparedness. He turned and started slowly through the gate, his shoulders hunched and pulled backward. Jordan got down from the saddle, and Doane turned toward him slowly. Jordan came forward straight enough, with his feet apart, braced against staggering. He stopped 3 feet from Doane, bent forward, his mouth slightly open. "You got any objections to me being in town?" "No," Doane said, and stood still. Jordan thought that over, his eyes drifting idly sideways for a moment. Then they came back to a finer focus this time, and he said, "Why not?" Hunching forward again, his hands open and held slightly away from the holsters at his hips. Doane looked at the point of his nose. "You haven't done anything, Jordan, except get drunk. Nothing to break the law." "I haven't done nothing," Jordan said, his eyes squinting away at one of the small tilting tombstones. "By God, I'll do something. What do I gotta do?" He drew his head back as though he were farsighted and then squinted. "What do I gotta do to make you fight, huh?" "Don't do anything," Doane said quietly, keeping his voice even. "Just go back and have another drink. Have a good time." "You think I ain't sober enough to fight?" Jordan slipped his right gun out of its holster and turned it away from Doane. Doane stiffened. "Wait, mister," Jordan said. He cocked his gun. "See that bird?" He raised the gun into the air, squinting along the barrel. The bright nickel of its finish gleamed in the sun. The lark wheeled and fluttered. Jordan's arm swung unsteadily in a small circle. He pulled the trigger and the gun blasted. The lark jumped in the air, flew about 20 feet and began circling again, catching insects. "I missed him," Jordan mumbled, lowering his arm and wiping the sweat off his forehead. "Oh, damn it, I can't see." He raised his arm again. Again, the heavy blast cracked Doane's ears. Down in the town near the Mexican shacks, he could see tiny figures run into the street. The bird didn't jump this time, but darted away out of sight over the hill. "I got him," Jordan said, scanning the sky. His eyes wandered over the graveyard for a moment, looking for the bird's body. "Now you see," he said, turning to Doane, his eyes blurred and watering with the sun's glare. "I'm going down and shoot up the whole damn town. Come down and stop me, you old..." He turned and lurched sideways a step, straightened himself out, and walked more steadily toward his horse, laughing to himself. Doane turned away, his face sick, and trudged slowly up the hill, his eyes on the ground. He stopped at one of the newer graves. The headstone was straight on this one. He looked at it, his face changing expression. "Here lies Cecilia Doane. Born 1837, died 1885. The loyal wife." He stopped and pulled a weed from the side of the grave, and then pulled a bunch of withered stems from a small green funnel by the headstone, and awkwardly took the fresh flowers out of the newspaper he had brought. He put the flowers into the funnel, wedging them firmly down into the bottom, and set it down again. He stood up and moved back, wiping sweat from his eyes. A sudden shout came from behind the gate and the sharp crack of a whip. Doane turned with a befuddled look. Jordan was back on his horse and beating Doane's. He had looped the reins over its neck so that it would run free. It was tearing away down the slope, headed back for town. Doane stood with his hat in his hand, his face suddenly beet red. He took a step after Jordan and then stood still, shaking a little. He stared fixedly after him, watching him turn into the main road and toward the main street again. Then, sighing deeply, he turned back to the grave. Folding the newspaper, he began dusting off the heavy slab, whispering to himself, "I know, sissy, I could have gone. But you know, it's my town." He straightened up, his face flushed, put on his hat, and slapping the folded paper against his knee, he started down the path. He got to the Missouri gate, closed it, and started down the ruts again. A shot came from the town, and he stopped. There were 2 more, sharp spurts of sound coming clear and definite across the sage. He made out a tiny figure in a blue shirt running along a sidewalk. He stood stock still, the grasshoppers singing in a contented chorus all around him in the bright yellow glare. Then he heard it. A train whistle came faint off from the plain, and he looked far across it. He made out the tiny trailed plume of smoke. His knees began to quiver slightly, and he began to walk very slowly down the road. Then suddenly there was a splatter of shots from below. The train whistle came again, louder, a crying wail of despair in the burning, brilliant, dancing air. He began to hurry, stumbling a little in the ruts. Then he stopped short, his face open in fear. Oh my God, my empty horse, and those shots. Oh, Toby! He began to run, shambling, awkward and stumbling, his face ashen. From the end of the street, as he hobbled panting past the tight-shut Mexican shanties, he could see a blue patch in the dust in front of the saloon and shambled to a halt. It wasn't Toby, whoever it was, lying there face down, a face buried in the deep, billowing dust, feet still on the board sidewalk where the man had been standing. The street was empty. None of the faces he knew looked at him now. He drew one of his guns and cocked it as he walked fast up the walk, on the saloon side. A shot smashed ahead of him and he stopped, shrinking against a storefront. Inside, through the glass door, he could see two pale faces in the murk. Blue powder smoke curled out from under the saloon porch ahead of him. Another shot smashed, this time from his office. The spurt of smoke, almost invisible in the sunlight, was low down in the doorway. Two horses were loose in the street now, his own, standing alert up past the saloon, and young Jordan's, half up on the boardwalk under one of the porches. He walked forward, past young Jordan's horse, to the corner of the saloon building. Another shot slammed out of his office door, the bullet smacking the window ahead of him. A small, slow smile grew on his mouth. He looked sideways at the body in the street. Young Jordan lay with the back of his head open to the sun, crimson and brilliant, his bright nickel gun in his right hand, his hammer still cocked, unfired. The train whistle moaned again, closer. "Doane!" Toby called from the office door invisible. "Get out of town!" There was a surge of effort in the voice, a strain that made it almost a squeal. "I'm shot in the leg! Get out before they get together!" A door slammed somewhere. Doane glanced down between the saloon and the store beside it. Then he saw, 50 yards down the street, a figure come out of another side alley and hurry away down the walk toward the station. From the saloon door, another shot slammed across the street. Toby held his fire. Doane peered after the running figure, his eyes squinting thoughtfully. The train's whistle shrieked again, like the ultimatum of an approaching conqueror at the edge of town. In a moment, the ground under his feet began to vibrate slightly, and the sound of braking wheels came up the street. He turned back to young Jordan's horse, petted it around the head a moment, then took it by the reins close to the bit. He guided it across the street, keeping its body between him and the front of the saloon without drawing fire, and went on down the alley beside his office. At the rear door, he hitched the horse and went inside. Toby was on the floor, a gun in his hand, his hat beside him, peering out across the sill. Doane kept low beneath the level of the window and crawled up to him. Toby's left leg was twisted, and blood leaked steadily out of the boot top onto the floor. His face was sweating and very pale. His lips were tight. "I thought he got you," Toby said, keeping his eyes on the saloon across the street. "I heard those shots, and then your horse came bucketing back down the street with an empty saddle. I got Jordan. Colby got me in the leg before I got back inside." "Never mind about that. Get on your feet if you can, and I'll help you on the horse in the back. You can get out of town and I'll manage for myself." "I think I'm going to pass out. I don't want to move. It won't hurt no worse getting killed than it does now. To hell with the horse. Take it yourself." Doane looked across the street, his eyes moving over the door and the windows carefully, inch by inch. "I'm sorry I shot him," Toby said. "It's all my fault. And it's my fault now, Doane. Clear out." Doane turned and scuttled out of the back. He mounted the horse and rode down behind 4 stores. He turned up another alley, dashed across the main street, down another alley, then back up behind the saloon. He dismounted, his gun cocked in his hand. The back door of the place was open, and he got through it quickly. The sound of his boot heels dimmed under the blast of a shot from the front of the saloon. From the dark rear of the room, he could see Pierce crouched behind the bar, squinting through a bullet hole in the stained glass bottom half of the front window. There was a bottle of whiskey standing on the bar beside Pierce. He reached out a hand and tilted the bottle up to his mouth, half turning toward Doane as he did so. Pierce kept the bottle to his lips, pretending to drink, and with his right hand invisible behind the bar, brought his gun into line with Doane. The tip of Pierce's gun came over the edge of the bar, the rest of him not moving a hair, and Doane, gritting his teeth, squeezed slowly and painfully on his gun trigger. The gun flamed and bucked in his hand, and he dropped it, his face twisting in agony. The bottle fell out of Pierce's hand and spun slowly on the bar. Pierce sat there a moment before his head fell forward, and he crashed against the edge of the bar and slipped down out of sight. Doane picked up his gun with his left hand and walked forward to the bar, holding his right hand like a crippled pole in front of him. The bottle had stopped revolving. Whiskey inside it, moving back and forth, rocked it gently. He righted it and took a short pull at the neck, and in a moment the pain lines relaxed in his face. He went to the bat-wing doors and pushed one of them partly open. "Toby!" he called. There was no answer from across the street, and then he saw the barrel of a revolver sticking out of his office door lying flat, and behind it one hand curled loosely and uselessly around the butt. He looked down the street. The train stood across it. A brakeman moved along the cars slowly, his head down. There was nobody else in sight. He started to step out and saw two men coming up the opposite walk, running fast. Suddenly one of them stopped, grabbing the other by the arm, and pointed at him. He stared back for a moment, seeing the senior Jordan clearly now, the square, hard face unchanged except for his pallor, bleak and bony as before. Doane let the door swing to and continued to watch them over the top of it. They talked for a moment. Then Colby ran back down the street, well out of effective range, and sprinted across it and disappeared. Down the street, the engine, hidden by buildings, chuffed angrily, and the cars began to move again. Jordan stood still, leaning against the front of a building, fully exposed, a hard smile on his face. Doane turned and hurried to the back door. It opened outward. He slammed it and bolted it and hurried back to the front and waited, his gun ready. He smiled as the back door rattled. He turned and fired a shot at it and listened. For a moment there was no sound. Then something solid hit it, bumped it a couple of times, and then silence came again. From the side of the building, just beyond the corner where Pierce's body lay, a shot crashed. Toby's gun jumped out of his hand and spun wildly. His hand lay still. He heard Jordan's voice from down the street calling. "Is he dead?" "I think he's passed out," Colby called back. "I'm going around back to get him. Keep Doane inside." Jordan turned and disappeared down an alley. Doane leaned across the bar, knocked bottles off the shelves of the back bar, and held his pistol in the corner of the wall. Across the street he could see somebody moving in his office, dimly beyond the window. Suddenly, the limp hand on the floor disappeared. "Come on out, you old," Pierce said, panting. "You only skinned me." His voice was closer than before, somewhere between the door and the corner of the building, below the level of the stained glass. Then Doane saw Toby's white shirt beyond the window opposite. Jordan was holding him up and moving toward the door. Jordan came out on the porch, hugging Toby around the chest, protecting himself with the limp body. With a heave, he sent Toby flying down the steps and jumped back out of sight. Toby rolled across the sidewalk and fell into the street, where he lay motionless. Doane looked stupidly at Toby, then at young Jordan, still lying with his feet cocked on the sidewalk. "He ain't dead, Doane," Jordan called. "Come and get him if you want him alive." He fired through the window. Dust jumped 6 inches from Toby's head. "Come on out, Doane, and shoot it out. You got a chance to save him." The gun roared again, and dust jumped a second time beside Toby's head, almost in the same spot. "Leave the kid alone," Doane called. "This fight's between you and me." "The next shot kills him, Doane." Doane's face sagged white, and he leaned against the side of the door. He could hear Pierce breathing heavily in the silence just outside. He pushed himself away from the door and drew a breath through clenched teeth. He cocked his pistol and strode out, swinging around. Pierce fired from the sidewalk, and Doane aimed straight into the blast and pulled as he felt himself flung violently around by Pierce's bullet. Pierce came up from the sidewalk and took 2 steps toward him, opening and closing a mouth that was suddenly full of blood, his eyes wide and wild, and then fell down at his feet. Doane's right arm hung useless, his gun at his feet. With his left hand he drew his other gun and stepped out from the sidewalk, his mouth wide open as though he were gasping for breath or were about to scream, and took 2 steps toward Toby as Jordan came out of the office door firing. The slug caught Doane along the side of his neck, cutting the shoulder muscle, and his head fell over to one side. He staggered on, firing. He saw Toby trying to get up in the street, saw Jordan fall back against the building, red running down the front of his shirt, his smile gone. Jordan stood braced against the building, holding his gun in both hands, firing as he slowly slid down. One bullet took Doane in the stomach, another in the knee. He went down, flopped forward, and dragged himself to where Toby lay, trying to prop himself up on one elbow. Doane knelt there like a dog, puking blood into the dust, blood running out of his nose, but his gray eyes almost indifferent, as though there were one man dying and another man watching. He saw Jordan lift his gun with both hands and aim it toward Toby, and as the hammer fell, he threw himself across Toby's head and took it in the back. He rolled off onto his back and lay staring in the sky. Upside down, he saw Toby take his gun and get up on one elbow, level it at Jordan, and fire. and then saw Toby's face looking down at him as the deputy knelt in the street. They stayed that way for a long moment, while Doane's eyes grew more and more dull, and the dark of his blood in the white dust grew broader. His breath was coming hard, in small, sharp gasps. "It's like I said, there's nothing in it, kid," he whispered. "Only a tin star. They don't even hang the right ones. You gotta fight everything twice. It's a job for a dog." Toby looked at him. "Thank you, Doane. It's all for free. You gonna quit, Toby?" Toby looked down at the gray face, the mouth and chin and neck crimson, the gray eyes dull. Toby shook his head. His face was hard as a rock. Doane's face suddenly looked a little surprised. His eyes went past Toby to the sky. Toby looked up. A lark was high above them, circling and fluttering directly overhead. "Look at that," Doane mumbled. "A pretty bird. A very pretty bird." His head turned slowly to one side, and Toby looked down at him and saw him as though he was fast asleep. He took Doane's gun in his hand and took off Doane's star and sat there in the street while men slowly came out of their stores and circled about them. He sat there unmoving, looking at Doane's half-averted face, holding the two things tightly, one in each hand like a child with a broken toy, his face soft and blurred, his eyes unwet. After a while, the lark went away. He looked up at the men and saw Metric. "I told him he should have resigned," Metric said, his voice shaking. "He could have taken his horse and—" "Shut up," Toby said. "Shut up or get out." His eyes were sharp and his face like stone. He turned to another one of the men. "Go get the doc. I got a busted leg and I've got a lot to do." All right, there you have it. That was John Cunningham's most famous story, being The Tin Star from 1947, which moviegoers around the globe know better as the legendary Western film High Noon. This short story was quite different from the movie High Noon, and I was fascinated to see what the differences were as I read it. So one of the big takeaways is the difference between the author's story and then the screenplay writer's story. And this is a great example of that, because we know that the original story was called The Tin Star by John W. Cunningham. This was written in 1947, and this appeared in Colliers Magazine. It was a magazine they published once a week, and they'd have little stories in it like the Reader's Digest. That's where this appeared. Well, this seemed good enough to be made into a movie, which then was rewritten by screenplay writer Carl Foreman in a film produced by Stanley Kramer. I think that was in 1952. And I'm sure that if you're listening to this story, you're a fan of this movie, and you're noticing the differences as well. While the story is compelling and has some drama and some intense moments, it lacks a lot of things that the screenplay had, which is, of course, Sheriff Will Kane's inability to round up anybody who wants to help him in the town, if you've seen the original movie. He also recently gets married. His wife is still alive, and his wife is a pacifist who strongly protests about him staying and wants him to move on. The town people, while in the beginning of the movie fawn all over our sheriff, the moment they get word that these three criminals are coming back to the town, they completely turn on the sheriff, try to force him to leave, and they will not help him. So he has all that working against him in the screenplay, and the climax works out completely different in the screenplay than it does in this novel. So again, it's interesting to see the differences that a screenplay writer will do with a story, and this is a perfect example. Changing the ending, changing the characters, and just embellishing more to make the story more interesting and have a little more drama to it. I did like this story. I think that it was interesting how different it was, but again, it really focused with the two of them staying in the sheriff's office for most of the story and people coming into them, where it was the exact opposite in the screenplay. He was running all over town trying to find people instead of hiding out in his office. The movie itself, again, going from a short story to a screenplay to a major motion picture, which won 7 Academy Awards. If you know or don't know, High Noon won the Academy Award for Best Motion Picture, Best Director, Best Actor for Gary Cooper, and Best Screenplay by Carl Foreman. It won for Best Editing, and of course the wonderful scoring by Dmitri Tiomkin, and it had the best song, which is The Ballad of High Noon. I'm sure you guys are familiar with that, and that was a huge part of this movie's success, which also the short story and this read lacks. Interesting note was that John Wayne was originally offered the part for Will Kane, but he turned it down. It was then also offered to Gregory Peck, but he thought it was too similar to his role in a movie he did the year before called The Gunfighter. He said it was the biggest mistake of his career later on. Other people who declined were Marlon Brando, Montgomery Clift, and Charlton Heston, all declined. Then Gary Cooper takes it, and then here we are. So that's it. The Tin Star by John Cunningham. What did you think of it? And what's your thoughts on how it compares to the original High Noon? Leave me a comment below, let me know what you think, because I really do appreciate it. And believe me, I read every one. And if you like these reads, I'm trying to get more out, so please like and subscribe, that would be great. So I'm Jerry Scullion, thank you for listening, and remember, no matter where you go, there you are.